Hello, everybody. It is Saturday night at 9 o'clock Eastern Time. I'm Chris Weuve, and this is Starfleet Tactical. And, you know, I was going to start this show by saying something that I don't normally say, because I probably should. I probably should say things like, you know, hey, hit the like button and stuff like that. I just don't do that as a general rule. And I thought about saying it, and I looked over, and there are 11 likes, and there are 7 people watching the show. So you guys are hitting the like button. Good for you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody. So, okay. So like I said, I wasn't sure if I was going to have a show this week. The original plan was no. But then Mother Nature decided that it was going to be like 5 degrees below zero in Dayton, Ohio, which is where the Weuve Strategic Book and Game Reserve located at Beaver Valley Self-Storage in Beaver Creek, Ohio is. It was going to be insanely cold there and high winds Sunday for the trip back. And I decided that the last thing in the world I wanted to do was extreme weather, extreme cold and high winds while driving through the mountains. So, hey, we're going to have a show tonight. That's fantastic. Let's see. T-shirt time. This is from Darts and Droids. It says, Cheddar Monk, lawful good in theory. If you read that comic strip, it's one of those comic strips that's based upon screen captures. It's basically the premise is that they're playing a role-playing game that you and I would recognize as being Star Wars, and it's all done based upon screen captures from the movie. And part of the voluminous backstory is explaining what Jedi Knights are, etc. And the one character can never keep it straight. He thinks he's a Cheddar Monk. So tonight, now that we've gotten that all out of the way, we are going to talk a little bit. It's a follow-on to last week's episode about the Spaceflight Chronology. Let's talk about that a little bit more. And specifically, let's talk about the Marshall-class destroyer, which is one of the standout designs in that book. So this is an episode that I heartily encourage everybody to get in touch with their inner 12-year-old. Because that is like literally about how old I was when this first came off. When the book first came out and Star Trek the Motion Picture came out. I was born in 1965. So in 1979, I was actually like 13, 14 when all that came out. And so, you know, that's sort of the mindset I put myself in for this. And so that's what we're going to do tonight is go through and look at the Marshall class destroyer and sort of approach it in context, et cetera, et cetera. So let me go ahead and throw up the slides. First of all, let me go back. As always, my views only, not the views of my employer. All the images are copyrighted by other people. And most of them come from J-Bot Jim Botatus, I think is how you say his name. I'm just not sure. He is a living person. I am talking about the work of a living person. I have not asked his permission to do that. I've never met the man. I've never exchanged emails with him. And to the best of my knowledge, actually, we might have exchanged emails at one point. But in any event, I'm going to talk about his stuff without his permission. And in a few places, I'm going to be critical, but I should emphasize, first of all, that I'm using his images for the purposes of criticism and education. And second of all, his work is fantastic and you can buy it. I recommend that you go to his website and see all of his stuff and download the stuff that he's got available. And you can get stuff, and you know, it's suitable for framing and stuff like that. And I would encourage people to go explore his site because he's got a lot of cool stuff. And we're going to explore his site some more in the future because there is a lot of cool stuff. And I intend to do some more episodes that are kind of like the one we're doing tonight. So here's kind of the state of play. My schedule is still in a state of flux because, hey, it's the wintertime and there's weather. So next week, I'm going to try to do the trip I didn't do this week and that I didn't do last week. So I'm going to go try visit my books next week. We'll see if that happens or not, but I'm going to try. The week after that, I'm expecting the answer will be yes, because I know that I'm going to be in Virginia, because I know I'm going to be in Charlottesville, Virginia on Sunday, but I'm going to be in Charlottesville, Virginia on Sunday for an open house. And I may end up helping the people who have the open house with their stuff and go down a day early, because my good friend Jim Bell had some medical issues. He had open heart surgery, and he is not going to be doing all the stuff that he does to with his wife to put on their open house. So I volunteered to go down and do it. So at some point I will get my marching orders that will tell me whether participation starting like at 9 o'clock on Sunday morning is good enough, or whether I need to go down on Saturday night beforehand. It's also evenly possible that I may go down on Saturday, spend the day helping them out, and then come back and do the show, and then go back again on Sunday. So I haven't yet decided yet. I'm expecting that the 21st will be probably a yes, because I'm expecting that I'm going to do the trip at some point. If I do not do the trip next week, then that 21st will probably end up turning into a no. Likewise on the 28th of February, if I don't get a trip in. So sometime in the next month, I'm going to go to Ohio. On February 7th, it is definitely a no. Paradoxically, I know I'm going to be in Ohio then, because I'm going to a science fiction convention, Cleveland Concoction, which is in one of the suburbs of Cleveland. I believe it's technically in Aurora, Ohio, which is southeast of Cleveland. Anybody who wants to go to this thing, I mean, I'm going to do the standard meetup thing. So I'm getting an extra room. I'm going to get a bunch of keys and just hand them out to people that are friends of mine. So if you want to come and hang with the crowd, feel free to the degree that there is a crowd. It may just be me. I think there's a couple of people that I know that are coming. But you're welcome to come and talk science fiction and gaming and all the rest of that stuff with us. So let's see. Let's talk about what's going on and the possible things to come up. I do definitely want to do the aircraft carriers in space, the revised edition of that. I'm going to do a handbook for space pioneers at some point. I'm in the near term, I'm thinking Strategic Space Command, Galactic Cruiser Leif Erikson. Oh, you're right. You're right, Bob. That should be March 7th, not February 7th. Okay, that last one is March 7th, not February 7th. So thank you for catching that for me.
I love how someone always catches a date issue.
Yeah, and if you didn't know any better, you'd say that I have no quality control whatsoever, because there's always a typo or something somewhere. It's actually, I'm going to spin that as a positive. It's actually an indication of my dedication to this show, that I will put on a show even if I have to throw it together at the last second and I don't have time to really sort of sit back and think about it, et cetera, et cetera. I just like doing the show, so I'll throw one together. And sometimes it means that this one, I finished the slides a couple of hours ago, although I kind of had it in my head all along. It was just a matter of sitting down and doing it. And I got a lot of other stuff done today. There's been one or two times where the show goes live at 9 o'clock and I finish the slides at like 8:35. Because it took me a while to sort of figure out what I'm going to do. Right now, I've got a pretty good idea, at least of what I'm going to have in the magazine Ready to Fire. So in the magazine Ready to Fire is going to be the Space 1999 and UFO things. I need to read some stuff for that, but those should be relatively quick kills. The Guide to the Orville book, it's a sort of a technical manual, so I'm going to sort of compare and contrast with Star Trek there. That might actually end up being more than one episode. I'll know once I get into the book. The Strategic Space Command Galactic Cruiser Leif Erikson, which is a model, like an old put it together with Tester's glue kind of model, that has a very storied history. It was sort of something that a lot of people, including Winchell Chung, are really big fans of. It came out in a couple of different versions. And Jerry Purnell used it as the model for the MacArthur, the battlecruiser MacArthur in Mote in God's Eye. And so as a result of that, it's a model that's got some It's got some gravitas to it. And it was also designed by Matt Jeffries, the same guy who designed the original Enterprise. So we're going to take a look at that at some point. And Handbook for Space Pioneers is something along those lines also. It came out in the 70s. It's in the form of the book that you get if you're going to go off and be on a colony world, explaining how the colonization process works. And it's got some really cool spacecraft designs that have some interesting implications for how you do modular spacecraft. And then I'm also going to do an update on sort of modular ship design, because I discovered a new modular ship thing. You may recall from previous episodes that the Danes came up with something called Standflex. Well, a Danish defense company called SH Defense has now come up with something called the Cube, which is containerized weapon systems. So with Standflex, you had to sort of plug modules into specially prepared emplacements. With the Cube system, it's more, everything is containerized and it's a lot more flexible, and you can move stuff around. And like, hey, maybe I don't need a missile launcher right now, so I'll move the missile launcher into storage and I'll bring out the thing I do need. And so I'm in the process of going through that and looking at all that stuff. And I might get into the old 4 Piper destroyers. You may recall that I also mentioned back in one of the modular episodes, talking about how in World War II, we had these World War I era 4 Piper destroyers that were in effect modular, and you could pull out boilers and engines to put in things like fuel tanks or troop quarters and use them as troop transports, or they used them as mine layers, and they used them as mine hunters, and they did all these things with them. They were kind of the literal combat ship of their day. And so I've done a little bit of reading on there. There's a book about that class of destroyers that I just finished. It's only got about 4 or 5 pages on all those variants. And then there's a longer book that I literally just ordered today, that I'm hoping has more detail about how they did that modular thing and what some of the issues they ran into as they were making those changes. And all of that stuff, I think, is readily transmittable to a science fiction setting. And then at some point we'll do 2300 and Jovian Chronicles, and the Exordium read along. I still need to get in touch with Sherwood Smith and Dave Trowbridge and find out exactly what's going on with the new edition of Exordium. So that's on the list. And Andy Presby and I spent a couple of hours yesterday talking about his Star Trek Power Systems talk. So he's gotten really, really busy at work, but he's going to go and give the talk at a science fiction convention next month. And that's sort of the beta test. And then once he's tweaked a little bit after that science fiction convention, he wants to come on the show and give it here. And it'll probably be end up being 2 episodes, I think. So let's see. Hello, everybody. Delon says there's a fairly good chance he's going to be going to Concoction. That's good. I talked with him earlier today, and I forgot to ask him about that. Hey, Wright, good to see you. Good to see you, Claude. Good to see you, Dustin. Good to see you, Bob. Good to see you, Hermano. It's good to see everybody. I really am. When I say that at the end of the show, that I'm really sort of honored and just stunned that people always come to the show and watch. I'm serious when I say that. I really am. Okay, let's go on. So here's what we're going to talk about today. Here's a more close-up of the Rick Sternbach illustration of the USS Patton. Nobody had ever heard about this ship until the book Spaceflight Chronology came out, and we saw it for the first time. And so I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction into it, most of which you've kind of already heard. I'm going to put it in the context of both the real world, i.e. Spaceflight Chronology, when that came out and how that fits into the way that Star Trek canon was developing. Let's talk about Spaceflight Chronology itself, what it says about the Marshall class and the USS Patton. And then we'll look very briefly at some other sources. And then I'm going to go through the JBOT, the Jim Botatis blueprints, the drawings that he did for that. And then I'm going to get in touch with my inner 12-year-old And we're going to talk about a few little variants and excursions. So I got a few ideas on how I would make modifications to it. And so let me emphasize once again, I think JBot does fantastic work. That having been said, I'm going to be a little critical of his interpretation of the Marshall, and I'm going to be a little I'm going to hammer home some recurring themes that I've talked about in the past that I think is just a general problem with science fiction blueprints writ large. And Star Trek blueprint designers, especially, going all the way back to Franz Joseph, in that they make these things look like buildings, and that not only are they like buildings, but they're like buildings that don't have structural members, whereas real world ships are not like buildings. There are parts of it that the people parts might have regular walls and things like that, but you get down to where the machinery spaces are, and you build a ship around your machinery, and then you put people access where you can, keeping in mind that they have to be able to do maintenance on it and stuff like that. But it's not the case that machinery fits in rooms. It's the case that rooms are built around machinery. And so that's going to be one of the recurring themes. Okay, so let's move on. So here is a side view of the ship. And as you can see, it looks very building-like. And you see a couple of important things in this side view of the ship. You see, first of all, the fact that this thing was conceptualized as actually landing. There's a ramp at the back. You can just walk out. This thing was conceptualized as landing on planets. It was also conceptualized as that command module forward, the hammerhead, is detachable. Now, I don't remember seeing anything that said that it had engines. In fact, I should have been looking for that. I just don't remember seeing them. Maybe they're in there somewhere. There must be, because there is a main engineering thing there towards the back of it. But it's got some very interesting attributes. And one of them that you might not be able to see is that the thing called the command module doesn't have the bridge. Has the emergency bridge. The main bridge is in the body of the ship. The emergency bridge is forward, which I'm okay with the main bridge being sort of buried in the body of the ship. It does kind of surprise me that the emergency bridge is forward, but I guess if you're going to detach it, you're going to want to do that. But overall, this is an interesting design, and I think that most fans, if you're a fan of Spaceflight Chronology and you disagree with what I'm about to say, please sing out. But I think most fans of this book think that the Marshall class is one of the standout designs in this book. It's certainly the one that when I first saw it, I went, "Wow, that's cool. That one's really cool. I really like that design." There's a handful of them in there, and it's one of the real standouts. And also, if you think about it, supposedly the ambush of the USS Patton, which was a relatively new Marshall class, according to the background here, it was one of the things that started the opening event of the Romulan War, the war with the Romulans, which is a really surprisingly poorly documented portion of Star Trek history. Now, I'm sure there's got to be Star Trek novels about it. So, like, if you go to beta canon sources or gamma canon or whatever it is that you call novels, there's probably some stuff there that talks a little bit more about it. In fact, I know that there is, and I'm going to show you why I know that in a slide or two. We don't, in terms of canon sources, we don't have a whole lot. Spaceflight Chronology was canon up until about 2002 when they revoked its license for being canon. And as a result of that, it was about the only sort of official source. And then Star Trek Enterprise came along, and you started getting hints that we were going to do the Romulan War. But other people have their own sort of timelines for the Romulan War, but it's really not a particularly well-documented portion of history. Okay, so here's the real world context for specifically the Marshall class. It's originally presented in this book that came out in like late December of 1979. It was literally like 1 week after Star Trek: The Motion Picture came out. The illustrations are by Rick Sternbach. The text is actually written by these two people who I've been unable to find any information on. I have not asked Rick Sternbach about it. And I have no idea whether he contributed to the text at all or whether he was purely an illustrator in this regard. Like I said, it was considered official until 2002. And as you can see, there's not a whole lot of stuff that came out before it. You had the original series, you had Franz Joseph, you had the Star Trek Concordance by Beau Trimble. And then Star Trek: The Motion Picture comes out, and 1 week later, Spaceflight Chronology comes out. So there really isn't a whole lot of stuff. There's some fan stuff. But in terms of things that Paramount was willing to say, like, yeah, that's real, that counts, there really wasn't that much at this point. And this is before you get things like the book Starship Design and the FOSSA role-playing game and stuff like that. And so this is actually a source for a lot of that stuff. The FOSSA role-playing game, for instance, clearly builds its timelines off of Spaceflight Chronology. Including the idea that the Federation had been around for about 20 years when the war started. Whereas you've got other sources that specifically say that the Federation had not, that United Earth fought the war, not the Federation, and that the Federation sort of, in some cases, germinated out of the war. Now, that's clearly not quite what we see in Star Trek Enterprise, but you sort of get the impression that they were heading in the direction of that war in Star Trek Enterprise. Okay, so here's what we see in Spaceflight Chronology about it. There's a separate little bit that's supposedly the log entry from the captain of the ship talking about how they had been ambushed. That occurred in 2106, so the class was still relatively new at the time. There's another little piece of text that is from the captain of the USS Hannibal, which was the flagship at the Battle of Charon at the end of the war. And a bunch of the sources say that the Marshall class was basically a stalwart of the war, that they built a bunch of them and they all fought during the war. There's other sources that say they planned on building even more, but they ended up building designs that were cheaper and easier to build in wartime, which is something the United States frequently does. Our wartime designs back in World War II, we had to crank them out, so we come up with stuff that we could crank out in wartime. This is in the days before phasers. It does say that they have photon torpedoes also in there somewhere, but it says that lasers and particle beams, no phasers there. But it does specifically say numerous innovations, all of which are in the very tiny text on the right-hand side there. But I pulled them out so that you could read them, that the separated engines lead to a dramatic increase in power. And so that's how, this is the first ship where you sort of see them spread apart like that. Maybe the Bonaventure has that. We'll take a look at the Bonaventure towards the end of the presentation. It's got a detachable command module, which you can see in the JBot illustration, that it's right behind the hammerhead. It's got warp-generated defensive shielding. Warp-generated defensive shielding. I don't quite know what warp-generated defensive shielding means, as opposed to just having shields or hull plating or whatever. But whatever it is, they've got it. And it also says that it uses a 10-to-1 matter to antimatter mix. And that's actually one of the interesting things about this book. And when I see that, I see the influence of Rick Sternbach when it starts talking in this book about matter to antimatter ratios. And like they make a big deal about talking on every entry. It's like this one is 10-to-1 matter to antimatter. In another one, it's 4-to-1. I think that was with the Moscow, if I remember correctly, or maybe that was the Horizon. And then you get to, because I think it was the Baton Rouge class that they were the first one to do one-to-one matter to antimatter mix. And there's an implication that you get more power from that, but it doesn't actually, I don't think it ever actually specifically says that in the book. What about other sources? What do they have to say about this? Well, Memory Alpha doesn't have anything else on it, so that tells me that it's not really mentioned in other canon sources. Memory Beta, on the other hand, says that the Romulan War occurred 20 years after the formation of the Federation, and that's listed in Spaceflight Chronology and the Fawcett timeline, but that doesn't match Star Trek Enterprise. So, okay, yeah, that tracks. The book Federation Spaceflight Chronology, which is sort of it's in the same sort of theme and recycled some of the illustrations, but it's a freebie that you can find. There's a compilation version of it, and then there's individual volumes of it. The compilation version, at least, says that there's a follow-on derivation of the Marshall class named the Patton class that I think was originally like a Marshall C, and they declared it to be the Patton class, and it's got upgraded capabilities, and it looks different. They've got a side-by-side, and it does look different. It also says that the Romulan War was largely fought between the clumsy cylindrical ships of the Federation versus the clumsy cylindrical ships of the Romulans, and what is clearly a reference to and includes even some of the artwork from the Starfleet Museum, which we talked about, I don't know, what, 6 months ago now? Back when it's got to be at least 6 months ago, because I'm pretty sure we did that back when I was still living in Ohio. And the idea is that ships like the Marshall were used as high-end flagships and the like. So you had a limited number of these ships, but you had ships that you could just crank out of the shipyard that did the bulk of the fighting. Starfleet Museum has no references to either the Marshall class or the USS Patton. I did a quick keyword search through the book and couldn't find anything in there. Okay, so let's do a deep dive on JBot. And this is something that comes specifically out of the website. You know, this is an illustration that's on one of the slides. So if you go to his website, so he sells decals for models, and he also has these blueprints. And you can buy the blueprint books from him, or you can download the individual PDF pages or the individual JPEGs. And so this is what I did for this, is I pulled individual JPEGs, and in some cases I cropped them down to make them fit on the screen a little bit better. This is a little box off to one side in one of them that sort of talks about some of the challenges he had in doing the blueprints. And basically what he's talking about here is that there's non-canon sources, there's like beta canon sources, must be novels or something like that, that give various descriptions of various parts of the size of various parts of this. Now, I don't know exactly what those sources are. I'd like to go take a look at them, because my guess is that'd be really cool, because it's got the Marshall class in it. So by definition, it'd be really cool, right? But he basically says that if you look at these different sources, what they describe doesn't make sense with this drawing. This is the drawing from Rick Sternbach from Spaceflight Chronology, and it doesn't make sense, because if you get the hammerhead right and you do everything proportionally, then the engines are the wrong size. And if you do the engines right and you do everything proportionally, then the hammerhead is the wrong size. He also points out some things that he thinks are going on here, like, for instance, that he thinks that the thing that you see marked here as number 5 is probably a shuttle bay. And that's probably a door that lifts up, and that the little dome that's labeled with the 6 might be the shuttle bay control. I'm a little skeptical of that, because it doesn't have a very good field of view, although maybe I would have put it on the downslope there. Maybe, though, that the thought is it's got a 360-degree view, and that if you put it too far down the downslope, then you can't see beyond the door when the door is raised. I don't know. You know, it could be. It's really kind of unclear as to exactly what it is. So here's the profile views, and the one illustration you've already seen, which is the cutaway, and then here it is without the cutaway. That little white fin thing is an outline of the Space Shuttle Enterprise for scale. So that's part of the wing of the Space Shuttle. This isn't a particularly big ship as these things go, and it supposedly has a duration of 6 years, an endurance of 6 years, which is a big deal. That's a long duration ship. And one of the things that I think is sort of notable about this design, and you get a little bit of the feel for it here, but a much better feel when you see the top view, is how big those engines are compared to the rest of the ship. Oh my God, they're monstrous. They're just really big. One of the other things I don't remember seeing a lot of references to like laser emplacements and particle beams and stuff, and the sources say it's got like 22 lasers, but I don't think they're really well represented on the blueprints here, on the drawings here. So, but you can see, that's what it looks like. You've got a navigational deflector, you've got sort of the hammerhead forward, and you've got a big, so you kind of have a primary hull and you kind of have a secondary hull, although I think they call that the command module. Okay, so here's a top view of it. And you can see sort of where the dividing line is there between the command module and supposedly where it separates. And you can see how big those engines are compared to the rest of the ship. Now, think about what this image looks like. Think about what you saw in the Sternbach image. I'm going to go back and show you those side by side later on. But, as a little bit of foreshadowing, this doesn't quite match what Rick Sternbach showed us. It's cool and everything. It's not quite what Sternbach showed us. So we'll get to that. Here is a cutaway that sort of, I guess, is sort of midline of the ship. And you can see those blue areas are water tanks. This thing has just huge amounts of water tanks, which is a good thing. Those engines are just fantastically large. And aside from the water tanks, the rest of it is really kind of designed like a building. So that's sort of the issue. This is the cover page. So that's why the format's a little bit different, is that it's the cover of the entire slide deck, or the blueprint set. The hydroponics there are a nice touch. They make a comment about how they're going to be gone for 6 years and they're going to have to grow some of their own food along the way. Like I said, there's lots of water tanks all over the place. We're going to see some more evidence of that later on. There's a galley there. They call it a kitchen. Navy-wise, you'd want to call that a galley. Let's move on. So here's a little bit more detail. You can see now I'll note these came from different slides, different sheets in the blueprint set. They are not to the same scale. I made the hammerhead on the left hand. I made it bigger to take up the space. They're not to the same scale. The bridges are about the same size. So you have the primary bridge on the right buried in the hull. And if you zoom in on it, it looks just like an Enterprise bridge, just like the original series bridge, except the elevator is, the turbolift door is directly aft. It's not off to one side. The emergency bridge is a little bit smaller. It's, I'm sorry, not smaller. It's got fewer positions in it. And it appears to have computer core facilities around the outside of that. That's what you usually see. How Franz Joseph would represent the computer core. And I can't remember if that's the computer core on the right-hand side or not. It wouldn't surprise me if that's not what you're seeing. So one of the things you should be asking yourself is, why are computers so big in this universe? And there's a couple of reasons for that. One of them is the universe, of course, was imagined in the 1960s when computers were still pretty good size. They certainly weren't as big as World War II computers when they were all had vacuum tubes and stuff, but they're still in mechanical relays, but they're still pretty good size. The other thing is, and this is something that came in later on, and I'm not sure exactly in canon when this first arrived, But if you go to Sternbach and Okuda's Star Trek Next Gen Tech Manual, it specifically says that the computer core has subspace field generators around it so that the computer is actually calculating it faster than light speeds. And so my own personal headcanon when I see the huge computer core is that, yeah, they're doing tricks like that. And so what we're seeing is the computer core may include a bunch of other gear that is technically not the computer core, but makes the computer core work. So that's where I think it's going on there. Yeah, Bob put Travelers listed their computer in terms of tons, which is just crazy. And everything you had to do with a Traveler computer was just crazy. Okay, so let's talk about a few issues I have with these slides, because I said that I had some issues with the blueprint. And so here's a couple of examples. So first of all, I'm less than impressed by that front and rear view. I've thought that from certain angles, the ship has some problems, and I think this could have been better. But I think that the JBot version, I'm not happy with what this looks like from the front and side view. I wish the primary hull was a little beefier and the secondary hull was a little beefier. You know, maybe that's just the angles, but that's sort of an aesthetic thing. So take it or leave it. On the left-hand side at the top, you see the fact that, yeah, it's kind of arranged like a building, right? It's kind of arranged like an apartment block, when there really isn't any places here where you sort of see there's big pieces of gear and you sort of wrap the ship around the big pieces of gear. Now, you might be able to make the argument that, well, Chris, the big pieces of gear where you wrap the ship around it they're in the nacelles, right? So they're you don't have to do that with your people person, because every automation is good enough that you don't have to be able to get to all that stuff. And so you just go ahead and do it that way. Maybe I'm skeptical of that, especially considering where we end up going later on. I'm skeptical of earlier designs that don't have the secondary hull sort of filled with engineering gear necessary to make the star drive work. I was telling Andy Presby last night that I've come more and more to the feeling over the years, as my understanding has evolved and my research into all things Star Trek has evolved. I'm coming more and more to the conclusion over the years that the secondary hull is really about feeding the warp engines, and the ship is really sort of a giant propulsion plant with a saucer attached to it. Everything else is basically propulsion and hangar deck and a little bit of excess capacity there so that it can function as a lifeboat if it has to. But, you know, I think if they end up functioning as a lifeboat, you got people sleeping in the hallways. Better than dying, but they're probably sleeping in the hallways. And so I imagine that that's going to go back to earlier ships too. Now, when I said that, Andy's response to that was, yeah, and that's what made the motion picture enterprise such a big deal, is they had this huge secondary hull, but they came up with this new, more compact warp core. We're both operating under the assumption that the linear intermix shaft and all the the type of gear you see in Star Trek the Motion Picture was there all along. But what they were able to do is they were able to shrink all that stuff down and made a new engineering plant that was a lot more efficient and took up less volume. And as a result, you've now got this huge secondary hull that you can use to put those cargo modules in. And so, like, you've got a lot of excess capacity, and the ship, as a result, gets this huge increase in capability because it can carry so much more stuff for whatever it needs to carry stuff for. If nothing else, it can carry more antimatter and more food, or more raw materials for whatever food replicator system, food synthesizer you've got. and so more spare parts and stuff like that. And so it's got a much increased capability. This is way before that. I would expect that that there would be a lot more engineering stuff in the secondary hull than we actually see. The other thing that bugs me is I'm sick of the damn parks and arboretums and nature preserves and forests and all the rest of it that we keep seeing on ships. Yes, I understand that they're going to be gone for long periods of time and they need to do recreation, et cetera, et cetera. But this is a space, most of the time these things really sort of feel like they're mono-use spaces. There is no basketball court on an aircraft carrier. Well, actually there is. It's called the hangar bay. If you walk into an aircraft carrier, you can see that there's a scoreboard up on the wall of the hangar deck, on the hangar bay. It says us, a home team and away team. So they can clearly set up like a basketball court in the hangar bay if they want to play basketball. If they're in port and they want to do something like that, okay, that's great. They had grilling equipment for the Steel Beach picnic. So I have been to the cookout on the helicopter deck of a destroyer. That's fantastic, but you don't build a dedicated facility. And then here we've got a theater, we've got a gymnasium. Now, gymnasium is one of those things. Yeah, you do have a gym, right? You do take a compartment and you put a bunch of gear in it, and you do have a gym. So that makes a lot of sense. That's health of the crew, that you need to get exercise. But a lot of these other things, they're sort of mono-use spaces, and I don't understand why you would, in a ship this small, why you would do something like that, have a space like that. So, okay, moving on. Issues number 2. Remember when I said that the JBot version doesn't actually match the Rick Sternbach version? So here's the proof of that. So if you look at the sort of brackets on the left, the top bracket shows you how wide the hammerhead is. I just duplicated that bracket, moved it down. The hammerhead on the design below is a lot wider. Go to the other end of the ship and you'll see that the stance of the ship is a lot wider too. So the engines are farther apart. The engines are about the same length. They're maybe just a shade longer, but they're farther apart. Once again, the bracket on the top and the bracket on the bottom are the same size. If you go to amidships, you'll see there's another bracket there that is the width of the ship amidships at the widest point of that secondary hull. And those brackets are the same size. So it's sort of bulkier. So this ship really looks like it's squashed. And the one thing I didn't do that I really should have is I should have stretched it out to see what happens if you just stretch it out. And after we're done, I'm going to do that. Maybe I'll show it next time. And then finally, those parallel lines, those are at the front and the back of the, let's call it the neck of the JBot version. As you can see, the neck of the Sternbach version is longer. And so I think the Sternbach version looks better. I just do. Now, let me emphasize, I love JBot's stuff. His bridge design is fantastic. We spent a lot of time talking about how he showed the bridge and stuff there. And I really love his stuff. He's done some fantastic stuff. And he continues to work on it. Like this was most recently updated in July of 2024. So he's continuing to work on these illustrations and stuff. And so it's good. I just don't think it's as good as it could be. And I'm very sympathetic to the fact, like he said in that earlier slide that had the pink boxes around it, that the different sources are not in agreement. And so I think maybe what we are seeing here is he looked at some other sources, maybe some other illustrations that people had done, because he made a reference to that, and I haven't seen any Marshall class destroyers that were done by somebody other than him or Sternbach. So maybe somebody else has done them, and I just don't know about them. But he did say something about, there are these other sources, and you can't square it. And I think what he did is he basically just borrowed information from the other sources and did a ship with the same general layout based upon that, like total length and size of the engines and stuff like that. I suspect that's what happened. I don't know for a fact. Okay, so now let's take a look at a couple of variants and excursions here. So everybody, if you're not yet in touch with your inner 12-year-old, take a deep breath. Remember what it's like to be 12. Remember what it's like to do things like get graph paper and draw your own version of the ship. What it's like to, what I would sometimes do is photocopy them and then cut them apart and move the pieces around. We're going to do some of that. And I'm going to show you two variants, one of which changes the profile and one of which changes the hammerhead. And these are ideas that I literally came up with these ideas when I was like in 8th grade. So here we go. First one, fixing the profile. So in the top, we have the profile from the original Sternbach image. So all I did here was I took the image and duplicated it. I cropped it down so it was only the top, cropped it to the center line. I flipped it and I moved it over the image to give it a new bottom. So the bottom and the top are mirrored in this. And I think that the top image looks it's got kind of a pot belly. The bottom one does not. Now, I'll note, where's the navigational deflector on this thing? Well, Sternbach didn't even have a navigational deflector in this thing. I don't know where the navigational deflector in this thing is. I know where I would put it. I'd put it in that damn hammerhead. Put it in the front where, God wants navigational deflectors to be. You put them up, you put them in a place where they've got a field of view of the front. And you can get away with that on most of the enterprises that we see because they're looking out so far that basically if the ship is maneuvering or anything like that, it still has plenty of time for something to come within its field of view and for it to deflect it. But in this case, I just put it up front. I think that's the right place to put it. So that's the first variation that I would do. Second variation is based upon the USS Bonaventure. So this is another ship from the Spaceflight Chronology. It's earlier in the ship. It's supposedly the first ship that has a warp drive. That big thing at the back is supposedly a radiator as opposed to being a thrust nozzle of some sort. And you can see that it's got weird pedal things. They never say exactly where the warp engines are. Maybe they're those things on either side, I guess, maybe. But I always thought that this was kind of a cool design, especially the front of that ship. And it occurred to me that you could do this. And so in that case, I just took the image of the Bonaventure. I cropped out the image of the front end of the Marshall class. I took the front end of the Bonaventure, cropped all the rest of the Bonaventure off, just slapped it on the front. The images are not quite lined up just perfectly because I think the scans were, half a degree off, etc. And I couldn't quite get the images to line up just perfectly because I don't think that they're straight. And I decided that this was good enough to get the idea across. I think that this balances out the warp nacelles a little bit better aesthetically. I mean, this is pure aesthetics in this one. I think it balances things out a little bit better and without making the command hull super wide, right? And I think giving a little bit of length on the front end helps too. So that's the second thing I came up with back when I was 12 years old or 13 years old. And that, I believe, yeah, that's the last slide. So let's go through and take a look at some of the comments here. Scrolling back up to the front. So apparently Lissa is a thief in Skyrim. Okay. Good for you, Lissa. Good for you. So she didn't come on for the rest of you, but she did turn her camera on enough to give me a thumbs up. Let's see. Scrolling. So Dustin says, what about adding 40K stuff to the list? 40K. So I love 40K, right? That should be clear. I love 40K. I was just looking around the room. I found my Dark Angel that I had over my shoulder at the old place, my Dark Angel figure. But he's in a box in the other room. I haven't pulled him out yet. And so he'll end up on the shelf at some point. I love 40K. I don't try to analyze it because I don't think you can, because I think it's pure pathos. I am very interested. The parts of 40K that I think you can analyze to the degree that you can analyze any of it are more strategic level stuff. It's not in the weeds sort of stuff. Like, I don't really have an opinion about 40K spacecraft. So I listen to a bunch of lore YouTubers all the time. I really got a thing for Necrons. Necrons are cool. Really got a thing for the Eldar. I like the Tau. I know that makes me persona non grata in some cases, but I do like the Tau. I know what I would do if I was working at Games Workshop and I had the power to do stuff. I'm not sure that I can do my thing with it more than just the occasional conversation with Alec. So I'm also not sure that the rest of the crowd would like it any more than we do already. Okay, so let's see. Bob's going to AwesomeCon. Oh, that's in March. I've never been to AwesomeCon. One of these days I should do that. In fact, if it's local, I might just buy a ticket and swing on by. Where is the USS Marshall's Bussard collectors? I don't think there are any, because I think the Bussard collector thing only came about much, much later. That's something that we didn't see until next gen. I think if I remember correctly, in Franz Joseph, they're labeled like matter, antimatter, sync. I know that there's a matter, antimatter sync somewhere. I think it's the glowy domes at the front, but they're not labeled as Bussard collectors. And if you look at it, that's the thing that's always sort of bugged me about the idea that they are Bussard collectors. Is, do they look like they're a collector? Do they? You would expect it to at least look like. I understand that the warp field is doing all the funneling, so I wouldn't expect it to be a big funnel thing, but I'd at least expect there to be a big hole. You don't see anything that looks like a hole. I think the idea is that it comes in around the glowy part, and it's sort of there's sort of like a ring around the glowy part that is where it actually gets collected in. Other than that, I can't imagine where it would be. So this is really before anybody was talking about Bussard collectors, before that had changed. Just like if you go back far enough, the main deflector is not labeled main deflector. It's labeled sensor dish, main sensor. The idea that it's a deflector may actually have come out with Next Gen Tech Manual. It might have been earlier than that, but it only became a deflector surprisingly late. Just like the detachable forward boom on the Klingon ships, I think the Klingon ships came first in that regard. I think they had to have come first because, you know, the Klingon ships go back to the original series. Oh, I think you're actually probably meaning, you're meaning within the timeline, within the in-universe timeline. Yeah, good question. I don't know. To be honest, as you've all probably noticed, I don't spend a whole lot of time going through alien ships in Star Trek. I generally talk about Starfleet. I talk about Starfleet design stuff, and I don't really talk about the Klingons, other than occasionally mentioning things like there's one source that say that Klingon warp engines have a fundamentally different approach to how they tie all the pieces together. And there are some Federation engineers that go, oh, that's clever. I kind of like the way that they do that. And so I think it's important to realize that how the Federation does things is not the be all and end all. We see that in one of the episodes of Deep Space Nine, where I think Kira is showing a Cardassian rifle versus a Federation phaser rifle to somebody who was going to need to use them. And she said, you know, the Federation rifle has like 80 different settings and it can do everything, but you got to know 80 different settings, right? Whereas the Cardassian rifle has like 4 settings and you can use it to break rocks because it's just durable as all get out, but it's only got 4 settings. You sort of get that impression about Klingon stuff too. Like there's at least one school of thought, you know, there's one school of thought that says that disruptors fire warp plasma and they're really a plasma weapon, blah, 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 blah. But there's another school of thought that basically says, yeah, the difference between a phaser and a disruptor is that a disruptor has only one setting. A phaser has like 4 settings, one of which is disrupt. Disruptor has only one setting. And, you know, it's the only setting they care about. So, okay, that makes sense to me. Let's see, scrolling. Why does the Marshall class look like a Klingon bird of prey if the nacelles were shorter length and attached on wings? Yeah, I can see that. I think that might be a case of form follows function. Now, the Klingon bird of prey is interesting because there's some stuff that got added on over the years. You know, clearly it was just done to be a cool looking ship in the movie. And then Foss said that there's like 4 or 5 different or 3 different sizes of it that basically got inflated up to bigger size because they realized that it works. The Klingon bird of prey tech manual, the Haynes manual that was done by Sternbach, includes this idea that it's got this fundamentally different warp field, that the wings are part of the warp field generation system, and it does some weird funky stuff. And I don't remember the details, but it does some weird funky stuff. But when you sort of look at it compared to, I think in some ways it's more comparable to like the D7. And I think a lot of that is just form follows function. At some point they realized you get better output of the warp engines if you spread them apart. And so once you start spreading them apart, you've got other engineering constraints you have to work with, like in terms of like the size of the warp field generated, et cetera, et cetera. And you start getting into things like, okay, if I spread these things apart and I have to put a defensive shield around it all, now I just made my job harder because the shield has to be bigger. And so everything in life is trade-offs, and I think those are some of the trade-offs that you see there, is the trade-off between how big you're going to make the defensive shield versus how great a warp efficiency. My guess is you also have things like things that make you go fast don't necessarily make you maneuverable. And a while ago, I asked everybody if they were okay with the idea of me pitching at some point my own sort of alternate Star Trek Design Bureau ideas about if I were designing this universe and sort of tweaking it, how I would make some of the things work. I haven't really done a whole lot of that. You all said you were okay with that. I still haven't pulled the trigger on that. But one of the things in my idea is that that the farther apart you put warp engines, the more maneuverable you are, but it impacts your speed. So for speed purposes, you want them close together. For maneuvering purposes, you want them far apart. And so there's sort of a balance between those two in terms of how you do that. And some of it's probably just, people got better over time. That's just true with everything. Like, for instance, we designed, I'm going to pull an example out of kind of the real world, but a weird place, and that is nuclear weapons design, right? We designed the original atomic bombs. There's 2 original designs. There's the gun type weapon, which we really decided very early on we didn't like using if we could, because it was relatively inefficient when it came to getting bang for the buck, and they're inherently dangerous because they they're much harder to make safe, because you find yourself in a situation where if it could accidentally go off in a way that implosion type weapons are much less unsafe, much less likely to have an accidental detonation. But the early weapons designs, like the bomb we dropped on Nagasaki was like 5 tons. The bomb we dropped on Hiroshima was like 4 tons. But Fat Man was 5 tons, and it was huge. And part of that was because it had an armored casing. That was about half the weight of the bomb. About another half of the weight of the bomb was the explosive package. So very quickly, like within the first 5 years, we figured out, okay, we need better explosives. So they got better explosives. So shrunk the size of the explosive package. We don't need to armor these things. So they stopped building them like tanks and started building them like airplanes. So they started using lightweight components and stuff to build them. They originally armored it because they thought that the airplane might take ground fire. They were worried about flak. And so later on they said, we don't care about flak. We just this bomb needs to be lightweight. So they built it out of aluminum and they didn't armor it. And the third thing was, and this was the big technological change, the others are just engineering changes, right? Well, I guess the explosives is a technological change, but the armoring is just like they made a different design choice. But then they figured out we can do something called a levitated pit. And it's basically you build a spacer in the weapon. And the spacer is between the explosive package and the physics package. And the idea is that spacer lets the explosion sort of get ahead of steam going. So the example I use the analogy I use for this is that it's like if you're going to break down a door, you're going to run into a door with your shoulder. What's the first thing you do? You take 3 steps back, because you need to be able to get up a good head of steam. You need to be able to get some momentum going. And that's basically what the levitated pit did, is that it let you get up a good head of steam. And the end result of that is our weapons went from like 5 tons to like 500 pounds for atomic weapons, for fission weapons, in about 5 years, 4 or 5 years. And so I think that there's probably something like that going on here too, in that everybody realized that they could make their ships more efficient. And if everybody's dealing with the same physics, you end up with certain similar things. Now, eventually I'm told levitated pits went away because we came up with other tricks and stuff. And so if that's the case, we see like the Klingon bird of prey, which is a relatively recent design in terms of the original series, right? The impression I get was that was a brand new ship brand new type of ship. They developed some new technology, and so that's what they were doing. So that's how technology works. Okay, scrolling down. Scott Voigt, good to see you. Yeah, Delon says that he remembers that there were some books that covered the Romulan War. There were some Enterprise books after the show Enterprise ended, and I think that's correct. So they would have been in between all of the episodes except the last one and the last one, which has a big element of founding of the Federation. Yeah, Dustin says something about imagine what the Marshal could do in the Dominion War if you sort of changed its gear and stuff like that. It's old technology, so I'm not sure that you could upgrade it in a meaningful way. And what we see in Star Trek is a willingness of the Federation to keep ships around for surprisingly long periods of time. This is another thing that Andy Presby and I were talking about last night. And I think what that means is that they keep stuff along as long as they can upgrade it. And when they get to the point where they can't upgrade it anymore in a meaningful way, and they don't have a meaningful role for it, that's when they get rid of stuff. Because the Federation has a problem that the US Navy doesn't. The US Navy doesn't have to worry about there being more ocean in 20 years than there is today. The planet isn't getting any bigger. The Federation is getting bigger. And so, as they go out and explore space, they've got more stuff to cover. And so that's why I think you end up with keeping stuff around for long periods of time. The Excelsior starts out as the super badass explorer battleship, jack of all trades, big kid on the block, and eventually it ends up delivering pizzas by the end of its lifespan. But at some point, it's still useful as a pizza delivery ship because you still need somebody to deliver the pizzas, and it's good. I say deliver the pizzas, I mean sort of like behind the scenes things. And there's something specific in there. I'm trying to remember what source it is. It says that flagships are usually Excelsior classes because they're good enough for an admiral. And it means that you're not actually using a frontline ship. You're not tying up a frontline ship to do all the ceremonial stuff. And you see the one ship that keeps going out to sea to visit Jean-Luc Picard and bring him the mail and do personnel transfers and stuff like that. There was a ship that kept showing up over and over again. Now, I will point out, as I always do, that the real reason why you see Mirandas and Excelsiors constantly show up in Next Gen and the other shows is because the model department had an entire shelf full of Mirandas and Excelsior models that they could use, and so they were saving money by recycling old models, etc. And I am totally and completely coming up with an excuse for something that is really just a TV show production issue. But I will also say what I always say when I point that out, which is I can come up with a real world excuse using real world principles. In the real world, if we had the same constraints that the Federation does, that Starfleet does, I can see us doing the same thing. Because in some ways, Federation starships have the Starfleet has a lot easier problem than the Navy does, from the standpoint that they're not immersing their ships in a solvent. They're not twisting them in 4 different directions at the same time through wave action. And they have automated repair sequences and structural integrity fields and another 300 years of material science to make sure that those ships can last a long, long time. And so my hypothesis is that most Federation starships don't really wear out. They just get to the point where it's not worth trying to upgrade them, at which point they become a source of high quality recyclables that they can turn into something using the most recent technology. I also think that Federation starships are designed to be really, really modular. And so the Mirandas that were coming off the assembly line at the end of the run of the Mirandas were not the same as the ones that came off at the beginning of the run. And the ones that are still flying in the time of the Next Generation in the Dominion War have, if you go aboard them, they look a lot different and have a lot different gear than the Mirandas that you saw in Star Trek the Motion Picture. And so even, they may have old style warp engines, but my guess is an old style warp engine has more modern components, more modern control software, a lot of extra gear to maximize the efficiency, et cetera, et cetera. My guess is they've been overhauled to the point where the commissioning engineer, that the original designer wouldn't recognize those ships anymore. So that's my thinking on that. Okay, so scrolling down. Yeah, Wright says John C. Butler and Buckley-class DEs come to mind, mass-produced escort vessels from World War II. Yeah. And, we did the same thing with the Four Pipers in World War I. We built like 100 in some of those things. Most of them went immediately into mothballs because we really didn't need that many. But we kept them around and we used them for some destroyer-type stuff early in the war, like the USS Ward, the ship that fired the opening shots of the war against Japan before the attack on Pearl Harbor earlier that day. USS Ward was one of those old four pipers. And so they were able to modify them into other things, et cetera, but they were around because we built like 100 of them. Because the U.S. Navy had a tendency to use destroyer in places where other people would use cruisers. Like we used destroyers for scouting for the fleet and stuff like that because we cranked out a shit ton of them. And the Washington Naval Treaty came in and there were limits on cruiser construction and there was the Great Depression and all the rest of it. When you add all that stuff up, we just used destroyers because we had them. Dustin says the Marshall looks like it would be right at home in Battlestar Galactica or Star Wars. Yeah, I could see that. I mean, the back of the warp engines don't look right. You'd need to have big glowy things back there. But other than that, I think you're right. Scott Voigt says Hammerhead speaking in Honorverse speak. Yep. Let's see. In the 60s and 70s, the IBM 9020 mainframe took up nearly 1,000 square feet. Scott says he had pictures of his system. Yeah, I worked at IBM at one point. I was a temp there for 6 months, 8 months, something like that. And there was the big computer floor down in the basement where they did data processing for banks and stuff like that. So you'd send all your data to the IBM and they'd turn it through and they'd send it back to you. And so there was this huge floor that just had all these mainframe computers and mini computers. And there was a control room that had literally, it was a room about the size of maybe a living room. And it was just computer tables all over the place. And each computer table had 3 monitors arranged like one sort of into the table, one straight up, and then one up high with 3 keyboards in front of it. And the operators would just go around running jobs and stuff like that. In fact, I had even applied for an actual no-shit position there where as an IBM regular employee, and I would have been one of the auxiliary operators. And those people were the people that did things like change the huge rolls of paper. I mean, these rolls of paper were like a foot in diameter, 2 feet in diameter for the printers. And you just put them on the printer and it would just churn stuff out. And so that ended up not happening, but it was actually sort of a cool thing. So, okay, there's a discussion about the weather. Weather here is currently 17 degrees. Scrolling. Scott and Wright, both Navy vets, are talking about things like Wright was on an LPD and he talked about doing Steel Beach picnics. It's fun watching people. So first of all, I remember watching them play basketball, and people did some really crazy stuff to prevent the ball from going off the side. They also played volleyball, but for volleyball, there's no way to prevent the ball from hitting into the water unless you physically restrain the ball. So the ball there was a net around the ball and a hook through the net, and it was like cabled to something offside. So they're playing volleyball with a ball that has a tether on it. The ball did not go in where you wanted it to, but it was fun to watch, and it was clearly, they just needed to go and do something different. That was what it was about. Okay, so scrolling. Why? Okay. Scott points out he never left his inner 12-year-old. Okay, that's good. That's good. Glad to hear that. Let's see. JCM, welcome. World War II Museum is great. Scrolling. Yeah, Alec would go feral for a 40K talk. Those who were around at the very beginning will recall this show started when I got invited onto Axanar After Dark. And on a show about Star Trek Axanar, Alec and I ended up spending 90 minutes talking about 40K. Because he was a fan going back to about 1992. I was a fan going back a couple of years early. So there was a couple of things there that I was in. I used to hang out at the local Games Workshop store. And so like Jervis Johnson would come over from England and stuff like that. And so like I had remember having a conversation with Jervis Johnson about why Terminators didn't have 2 Storm Bolters. And it was a very interesting conversation. So I got a lot of experience with Games Workshop in the early days. What I didn't get was a master's degree. Those things are probably related. Okay, scrolling down. Okay, now they're talking about Cat Girl Army, so I'm just going to scroll right on by that. Wright points out his 911 automatic has 2 settings, on and off. Okay, I'm getting close to the end here. Dustin says maybe Starfleet learned from the Klingons that just because something is old, you don't need to pull ships out of support work. I think the Federation kind of knew that because I think they designed ships to be upgradable. I think that's really what's going on there. And maybe they didn't used to do that, but I think that's a lesson that they learned over time, is that they should design ships to be upgradable. I also think that later on, when replicators became a thing, and I was talking with Andy about this last night, and this is when I do part 2 of the replicator talk. That's one of the things I want to get into, is I think you get to the point where you design stuff to be replicated. Everything gets designed to be easy to replicate. And so I think you eventually get to the point where you could have 2 circuit boards, and somebody who knows this and how this works can look at the 2 circuit boards and go, this one was designed by a culture that has replication technology because they clearly designed it to be easier to replicate. This one's easy to replicate. This one is a lot more energy intensive and requires more specialized thing. And I think that's what we see across the board, right? You do in the real world, we do stuff like that, right? Why are aluminum cans so ubiquitous? Why don't you drink out of a zinc can? To be honest, I don't know I don't know if zinc reacts with soda or whatever, but I do know that the thing about aluminum cans is that aluminum is really easy to recycle. So we can replicate aluminum a lot easier than we can replicate other things. And there was a time period where you used to do a lot of stuff with steel that's now done out of aluminum, and now you only really do steel stuff when you need to do steel stuff. And you need to sort of keep, because something is a lot heavier and you need to keep it for a longer period of time. You do aluminum for the stuff that you think you're not going to keep for very long, like soda, right? You're going to drink it right away. Yeah, Dustin says something about basically that there was stagnation in the combat department. I think that Federation, I think Starfleet adjusted to the times. You know, and that's one of the reasons why I think that you see phasers on everything, right? You don't necessarily see phasers on medical ships, but even stuff that's intended for the backwoods has a tendency to have weapons on it. Now, when you go back to the era of the original movies, you know, Wrath of Khan, the Miranda clearly had a lot of combat power, and I think that's because they were in a Cold War with the Klingons, and the expectation was it was going to go hot at any time. So everything was likely to be a combat vessel. But I think one of the reasons why Federation ships all have phasers is because they understand that if the balloon goes up, everybody's going to take their exploration stuff, set it aside, and now they're a combat force and they need to go do combat stuff. And so they're prepared to go to combat on the drop of a hat, at least in terms of their ship design. Whether they've got the mental acuity to do it, whether their tactics are up to date, whether they're updating their combat systems or not. I think that's one of the things that happened with the Borg is that what I see happening when the Borg show up, right, is I see that there's a couple of things that happen. First of all, there's a group of people that go, Starfleet sets up two task forces, two design teams to work the problem. One of them is given the task, what can we do right now? What can we do in the short term? And the other one is given the task, what can we do in the long term? What do we need to design to solve these problems? Those are two different tasks. And the United States does stuff like that too. We did that when we set up the Strategic Capabilities Office. The Strategic Capabilities Office in DoD was all about going and finding current technology and making changes to it. You know, how can we make the current technology better? What capabilities can we get? If we like combine, if we network that to that, what does that get us that we don't yet have because we haven't done that together? And so that's where you get things like putting palletized missile loads in the back of C-130s so that your C-130 can now be a strike platform. Stuff like that is the sort of, it was the initial response to the Borg. And then they also told Starfleet Research, hey, you need to work on these things. You need to work on better photon torpedoes, quantum torpedoes. You need to work on improving phasers. You need to work on improving shields. Some of that can be solved with just the fact that a Galaxy class has these big open spaces, you know, where they have like, you know, the Arboretum and stuff like that. And you hear talk about the war galaxies from the Dominion War. I think all those galaxies that we see fighting in the Dominion War do not look like the USS Enterprise. They don't have arboretums on board. They don't have classrooms for all the children on board. What they have is extra shield generators and extra fusion generators to power those shield generators. And so, and there's no reason why you couldn't take a ship like the 1701D in, strip out all that gear. Remember, you got transporters to do all that stuff, right? Strip out all that gear and put in more stuff. So I think those ships are pretty modular in that regard. Okay. Yeah, Wright talks about the B-52, that the last one came off the production line in 1962. And part of what makes that design last so long is they built it to last so long, not because they said, we think we're going to have it for a long time. Empirically, they didn't. They thought they were going to replace it with the B-58. They did not. Then they thought they were going to replace it with the B-70. They did not. Then they thought they were going to replace it with the B-1. They did not. But part of the deal was because they built it so fast, they didn't try to do anything fancy with materials or anything else like that. They said, why don't we just build it like a flying skyscraper? Big, thick steel beams. And so as a result, that platform has a lot of life in it. It has a lot of life in it because it's built to last in a way that those other aircraft were not. B-58 had some issues with its computer and it was really expensive to fly. B-1 was just sort of problematic in a bunch of different ways. One of which was, it was originally a high-level penetrator, and then it became a low-level penetrator. And the B-1 is a fantastic aircraft. But when the Cold War ended, you really kind of just needed a bomb truck. And the bomb truck thing, if I can just fire cruise missiles from outside and not have to do the full penetration thing. So maybe I can get by with just like 100 B-1s to do penetration to the places I need penetration, and then just use the bomb truck for everything else. The B-70, they realized, okay, high and fast isn't going to cut it. We need to go low altitude, and that's not the airplane to go low altitude. It was going to be insanely expensive to operate too. So. Yeah, Scott talks about using punch cards at the FAA in the 1980s. For some things, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And if the technology's still working, they still make a metric shit ton of floppy disks, 3.5-inch disks. They're still really, really used in a lot of different places. Because if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And every time you double the amount of memory the amount of storage that you cram into a particular place, you make it that much more vulnerable to be disrupted. Because if you're dealing with something as crude as a 3.5-inch disk drive, 1.44 megabytes, something that crude, kind of hard to screw up. Okay, scrolling. Yeah, Scott points out a lot of shipboard people are getting 3D printers now. So yeah, they're doing more and more stuff like that over time. Yeah, Dustin points out the Enterprise food replicator resequencer, I think is what they called it, seemed to be more advanced than the original series Enterprise. I don't know. The original series Enterprise was pretty advanced. You'd stick a computer disk into it, press a button, and like literally 5 seconds later, you've got a complete meal, including silverware, if I remember correctly. That seemed pretty advanced. The special effects weren't as good, but what it was able to do was pretty advanced. But of course, we run into the problem where, as time goes on, when people saw a communicator back in the 1960s, everybody went, "Oh my God, it's so small." Well, first of all, they went, "What is that?" Right? And then you look at a cell phone in the 1980s, and it's the size. A cell phone in the 1980s is like this big. I had one in the 1990s. I had a car phone that came in its own little black bag with like a shoulder strap and stuff like that. And it had a tiny range to get to a cell phone station. So, there's always that element that you have to make it look both future. When you're doing a prequel, you have to make it look more futuristic than what the viewer is current for the viewer, but still within the context of the show. And that's hard to do. That's really hard to do. And sometimes you just sort of go like, yeah, I'm going to care more about the viewer than this. Just pretend. Okay, that works. Yeah, as I said, zinc. I thought that maybe zinc was a bad example. So thank you, Lissa. Zinc is a bad example. Okay. One horse shay showing up at the end. I didn't see anything else from you. Yeah, hand communicator is still impressive for two-way ground to orbital communications. Yeah, they really are. Because basically that's a satellite phone with a range beyond any satellite phone that we currently have. But with a battery that lasts a really long time. Like, do you ever recall Kirk saying, yeah, I'm out of juice. I need to plug in. I need to recharge. Anybody got a battery? Anybody have a USB-C cable that I can use to recharge my communicator? So, yeah, Dustin points out the cage had a lot different nomenclature. They had hand lasers, vice phasers, and stuff like that. But so I am now officially at the end. And so we are currently at the hour and 31-minute mark. We actually, I think, finished the questions end up being about a third of the show as usual. So we'll spend about a half hour on questions, but I think it's time to go ahead and call it. And once again, I am always pleased and impressed and humbled by the fact that there are 31 people watching this show. So thank you very much for coming and watching tonight. And like I said, my default expectation is that there won't be a show next week, but who knows, depending upon weather. And I need to sort of figure out how to get back in time for the Super Bowl, because I'm going over to a friend's house to help him with his Super Bowl party. But in addition to that, I'm looking forward to putting together some stuff on the Galactic Cruiser Leif Erikson. So everybody, don't send your inner 12-year-old away, because we're going to need him again in the near future. And you've got plenty of other stuff to do. So I am looking forward to continue doing this throughout 2026. And with that, thank you very much, everybody. Have a good evening.